Chapter 26, Happy Birthday Harry. Nick took the wand maker's hand in a daze after hearing the story behind his wand, as it was beyond strange and fantastical. "I'll need to check the wand with the system later to try and figure out more about it," he decided worriedly. "For the privilege of matching you with your wand today I won't even charge you lads," Ollivander said with a happy smile. Harry and Nick left the shop with totally different thoughts on what had just happened. Harry was excited and happy for Nick, while Nick himself was worried that this might come back to bite him in the backside. In the books, unique tended to mean extremely powerful, and the only unique wand shown was the Elder Wand that was supposedly crafted by death itself. "My wand is made by the hybridization of the two most powerful birds in the world and a wood with a mysterious background. I'm fucked, aren't I?" Nick thought in despair. Truthfully speaking, Nick had hoped to just sort of blend into the background while at Hogwarts, but if his wand was as powerful as he feared, that may well be impossible, and that didn't even include the presence of not one, not two but three Master Legilimens. Namely Snape, Dumbledore, and one back of the head residing Voldemort, all of which are likely to take note of Nick for different reasons. Voldemort because he was an extremely talented orphan of mysterious heritage. Sounds familiar, right? Dumbledore for that same reason and because he was near Harry often. Snape ironically because of the other two same reasons, and maybe to nurture Nick's obvious talent in potions, but that was doubtful. As much as Snape might want to deny it, chemistry and potions were suspiciously similar, and Nick was going for his master's degree in the subject before he died. Those memories may be almost gone at this point, but clearly he had to have some talent in the fields to be so successful, right? Hagrid showed up coincidentally right when they exited the shop with a very large white and black spotted owl in a cage. "Happy birthday, Harry," he said happily, and completely seemed to not notice the owl in question trying its hardest to shrink away from Nick and shivering in fear and reverence. "Calm yourself." Nick spoke to the bird, and the owl visible relaxed but still maintained a respectfully lowered head. Hagrid finally noticed this odd behavior and frowned in confusion. Not normal, those actions, only seen such a thing when Professor Dumbledore's phoenix, Fawkes, was around. The man said seriously and started looking around for brilliant red and gold birds. Harry on the other hand realized that it was Nick that the bird was acting like this to, and remembered the story that Ollivander told them. He then explained this to Hagrid, who was stunned and fell into thought. Wizards are connected to their wands in mysterious ways, and I suppose if that story had an ounce of truth, you might seem like that mighty bird to our owl friend here. Hagrid said honestly. Suppose in her eyes you may well be royalty. Both thunderbirds and phoenixes are princely creatures after all. Hagrid continued excitedly. Nick just rolled his eyes, since he was aware that Hagrid was obsessed with magical creatures. The day ended with a trip to Fortescue's ice cream parlor, where Harry got 2 scoops of chocolate ice cream while Nick got 2 scoops of black walnut ice cream. Miss Smith was less than enthused by Harry bringing Hedwig back with him, but helplessly allowed it on the condition he cleaned but after her. The bird in question had chilled out considerably after being near Nick for a couple of hours and getting acclimated to his presence. Not to say she wasn't hanging on to his every action, merely just that she didn't look like she might die of fright at all moment. Harry seemed to look disappointed as time went on, and Nick seemed to have forgotten to get him a present. This changed when Nick tossed him a small shiny object just before they went to bed with a smirk. "Happy birthday, Harry," Nick said with a chuckle at the surprise on the boy's face as he gazed down at the ring. Nick was quite happy with how the ring turned out despite the suffering he went through because of it. Ring name, Autar. Grade, Rare. Abilities, Auto-sizing, Shield Summoning, Growth, Counterattack. Description: a ring designed to mimic a bird in flight, forged in the Celebrimbor style by Nicholas Iron with an advanced technique beyond his means to protect only one person ever, giving the enchantment growth type properties and higher potency. System appraisal: a simple but effective piece of jewelry that has the potential to be great, made by an up-and-coming ringsmith. Chapter 27, A Hard Choice. Nick had gotten the most points out of any forging so far with the creation of that ring at a total of 152 ring points. He was pretty sure that it was only because of the strict limitations he had placed on the ring during its creation. While the growth type ability was amazing, the fact remained that the only person it would ever work for was Harry alone. Even if it became the most powerful thing Nick ever makes, which he doubted, everyone else could only suck it up and look on enviously. Nick had no doubt at all that if he ever managed to make a growth type ring that wasn't bound to a single person, its rating would be leagues greater than Harry's ring. Still, Nick was happy that Harry liked his gift and pulled out his wand to give it a thorough look with the system before he turned in for the night. What he saw made his eyes bulge out in surprise and alarm the more he read. Wand, Primordial Wood / Celestial Bird Feather. Grade, Mythical. Abilities, Avian Dominion, Unrivaled Transfiguration, Fire Affinity, lightning affinity, water affinity, air affinity, growth. Mythical ability, Heaven's Wrath, summons a bolt of celestial energy at would-be thieves that damages the soul. Description: a wand that has the potential to rival any other wand made using masterful techniques from the wood of a primordial tree and the tail feather of a celestial bird. This wand only accepts those born of two separate things that should never have been fused yet have, and grants its wielder absolute authority over all avian creatures. System appraisal: a powerful wand whose destiny to never be wielded has been broken and will carve history with every stroke it makes. Nick almost choked on his own saliva as he swallowed nervously while looking at the wand in his hand. Oh yeah, I'm totally fucked. Nick thought in depression. At least I know why it chose me of all people. I am a soul from a different Earth that has been transmigrated to this one. A fusion of two things that never should have. Gotta make the best of it, I suppose. Nick thought with a sigh and gave up on his original plan of anonymity. For the first time in a while Nick dreamt of a certain brown-haired elven ringsmith. So you finally made something interesting, I see, Atarhe? Your naming sense is as bad as ever, it seems. The elf said in amusement. I'm not mocking, mind you, but surely there were greater names than Protector, right? A bit too late to change the name now, of course, but still the principle stands. The elf said in exasperation but became serious all of a sudden. I am not here for such petty reasons though. An anomaly has occurred due to the fusion of my crafting inheritance and your soul, causing it to begin to change towards becoming elven. This may bring unknown consequences the further the process goes. I was summoned here this time to ask your opinion of the matter by this strange system thing that is bound to you. The elf said seriously, surprising Nick. Wouldn't having an elven soul be a good thing though, he thought in confusion. Indeed, my own thoughts mirror your own on the matter. However, the system tells me that if you agree to allow the process to continue you will cease to be human as your body shifts alongside your soul into that of one of my own people, with all the pros and cons of such a thing. You will mature physically but otherwise remain as you are forever. You may be immortal but you will be alone as the only one of my race in this world. No other elf in the history of my people have ever been truly alone, and we are raised to accept our agelessness. You have not been. I cannot fault you should you choose to remain human as a result. I wish you had more time to choose, for yours is not an easy one to make, but the system says you only have 3 days until the process becomes unstoppable. I am sorry. The elf said sincerely before the dream ends and Nick wakes up. Chaos was the easiest way to describe Nick's current mindset, and it showed as his wand sparked and popped at his agitation. Accidental magic becomes hard after one has bonded to a wand, as the focus siphons off the excess magic and disperses it harmlessly most of the time. Anyone who has ever truly thought about what immortality actually entails in detail could tell you how Nick was feeling at the moment in a single word: lost. Chapter 28, Eternity Awaits. Nick was out of it for the rest of the day, and it showed as he would just get lost in thought randomly, and it took Harry shaking him to snap him back to reality. Nick couldn't help it as he fell into the trap that was known as philosophy. He was unable to definitively say which was truly a better choice, as both had their own problems. See, he may regret it forever by choosing either option, with only one of those being with him alive to see the world move on without him. Unless he cut off all contact with the outside world while immortal, there was simply no way to not get noticed eventually. He could take the route that the Flammels did by basically broadcasting his immortality once and then wait for the commotion to die down about it before resurfacing. While he may need to deal with the occasional person seeking to take his immortality somehow, by that point he would probably be invincible. Think about it for a moment: he would never leave his prime and would only grow more skilled and powerful as time went on, because he had all the time in the world to spend learning or experimenting. There was a single thing that was incorrect about what the elf had said, in that there were in fact several sources of immortality in this world. The Flammels had the stone, vampires were a thing that people always seemed to forget about, and then there was the nearly infinite ways just pure magic could be used to achieve the same. Voldemort himself took one such path with his Horcruxes, though it should be stated that he effectively cut off all paths to improvement as a result. Permanent soul damage is magically crippling, and he did it 6 times, removing any hope of recovery. As boring as it sounded, remaining human meant that Nick could live a nice full life, get married, have kids, grandkids, and eventually embrace death like an old friend. He would never need to deal with the boredom that came from doing literally everything. The worst thought he had, however, was that he may eventually become a Dark Lord just because it was some form of entertainment. Maybe he'd raise a super civilization in secret just to openly go to war with them to pass the time. The entire 3 days passed by before he finally was forced to make his choice, and he chose to embrace the change. He knew that even if somewhere far in the future he might turn cruel and evil, not taking the option was simply wasteful, and he admittedly didn't like the thought of growing old. The sleep he was expecting that night was once again centered around the brown-haired elf who had shown up once more. Nick made his choice and the elven man simply smiled and nodded in understanding before blackness overcame Nick. Nothing seems all that different. Nick thought in confusion but remembered that it was apparently an overtime kind of thing rather than a sudden change. How long exactly would it take me to go full elf, he wondered curiously since this was a totally new thing for him. Surprisingly he got an answer from the system. Approximately 3 years from this date. That's right before the events of the Goblet of Fire then, I can work with that, he thought calmly. Until then it's business as usual I guess. He mutters before yawning and getting out of bed to start his day. Nick knew he just needed a few more points in order to buy the enchantment from the system shop. As a result he was going to craft a few of his best quality rings to gain more points while also preparing for the nonsense he could expect from Hogwarts. One such ring he crafted out of the gold he got out of a single galleon. This ring was designed to resemble a woven rope and was quite the pain to make for Nick. He ended up having to suck it up and purchase some polishing paste for the ring in order to make it shiny and nice looking. This ring was intended for the caretaker since magical orphans like he and Harry had two options in regards to where they go for the summer holidays. The first was with the family of another student so long as the student wasn't Muggle-born. The second option was the one Nick planned on taking, which was an apprenticeship under a successful wizard. Surprisingly very few people chose this option simply because the first put them with their friends. Nick knew that if you apprentice under the right wizard you could learn a lot, such as for example, Ollivander. Chapter 29, Greed. The ring gave Nick enough points for the enchantment so he began working on his storage ring. The design he had for this was a bit special as he took inspiration from the boggats found in this world. To bring this design to fruition Nick grabbed a little of every single metal he had and forge welded them all together into a hideous sword of failure Damascus. Then he shaped this hard-to-work material into a plain banded ring. He then enchanted it with all his knowledge about mimics and boggats before shoving the purchased enchantment onto it as well. Ring name, Greed. Grade, Rare. Abilities, Auto-sizing, Formless, Devouring Counterattack, Fear Transformation, Storage, 3 cubic meters. Description, a monstrous creation that was created to be a hellish defender of its owner's belongings stored within. Much like a boggart, the ring doesn't have a set form and is constantly shifting while it waits for whoever is foolish enough to try and steal from it. System appraisal, a complex creation that makes one wonder about the mental state of the up-and-coming ring smith who made it. Nick chuckled at the description the system had of the ring but wasn't surprised at the rating since space manipulation was a fairly high-tier magic. Much like how it was described, the ring was constantly changing shape into unusual designs and colors on his left pointer finger. Much like Nick had assumed, he needed a storage device in order to unlock his inventory as it was now available. He wasted no time at all storing his school supplies and his trunk in the ring, much to Harry's envy. The boy who lived quickly learned not to try and grab the ring, however, when it transformed into Vernon's face and bit his hand. He wasn't very amused at all, but Nick thought it was hysterical to see such a fat face appear and bite someone. He did eventually apologize to Harry once he stopped laughing at him and explained that it was a anti-thievery method involving the thief's fears. Harry admitted that it was a pretty good idea but didn't really care how Nick enchanted the thing since he just chucked it up. To another weird thing about Nick. Even after learning about magic, Harry noticed that Nick was an anomaly even in that regard and gave up trying to figure his friend out. Every time he thought he had Nick figured out, an extra layer showed up, like the guy was an endless onion. For his mental well-being he just chose to acknowledge that Nick was strange and move on with his life. He did have Nick promise to take his trunk in the ring as well when they left for school in a bit less than a month. Nick didn't mind this at all and was going to do it anyways since it would be a pain to carry them otherwise. For the rest of the month Nick took advantage of the Ministry's grace period and heavily practiced magic in the workshop with Harry. His talent became apparent when he mastered each spell with laughable ease: Lumos, Wingardium Leviosa, Expelliarmus, the whole list found in the first year books. What was supposed to be an entire year's worth of spells took him barely that month to master and use fluently. The only subjects he couldn't get any practical experience with was transfiguration and potions, since he lacked the ingredients of one and the other only had theory knowledge in the book, probably on purpose since it was actually a very dangerous subject. One mistake and you may need to spend the rest of your life without a finger, kind of dangerous. An interesting thing that Nick figured out was that the Elvish that he knew thanks to the crafting style could be substituted with the Old Latin that made up most spells. In fact, it could be substituted for literally every spell regardless of language. Nick thought it might be because it was simply a more powerful language to use for spells. Oddly though, simply waving his wand and making a command in Elvish didn't actually do anything, most of the time anyways. One of the exceptions to this was when he said "Iglid," which was literally lightning in Elvish, and swung his wand in a downwards flick. This apparently created powerful bolt of electricity to appear that was so strong that even though it struck the ground right in front of him set off a sound like thunder and made a visible crater in the floor. Nick had decided to keep that in his bag of tricks in case he gets attacked by one back of the head Dark Lord, because the spell was so fast he thought a weakened Dark Lord may not be able to react to it. Chapter 30, Ronald Weasley. When September 1st came around, Nick and Harry were driven up to the train station by Miss Smith and dropped off, though not before Nick left her his gift. "So where is platform 9 3/4? Harry asked in confusion after not seeing any sign listed as such. Nick shrugged. "Maybe it's magically hidden between platforms 9 and 10. He said calmly, and Harry nodded in agreement. "How are we supposed to find it then?" he asked worriedly. Nick smiled. "Do you see anyone else that stands out by platform 9 or 10? he asked, giving Harry a hand. The bespectacled boy looked carefully and quickly noticed that there was indeed a few people who stood out, and much to his amazement he even watched as a family of 3 walked through what appeared to be a solid wall. He looked at Nick to see if he noticed this as well, and Nick nodded. "I'd guess that's where we need to go," he said seriously. Nick would be lying if he said he wasn't nervous when he ran into the wall with the luggage cart. Nothing odd happened, and he smoothly found himself on platform 9 3/4 with Harry and the other students. He had made sure that Harry covered his scar before they left the orphanage, and for good reason too, as the platform was crawling with reporters hoping to catch the boy who lived as he boarded the train. Nick had of course mentioned this to Harry before they left, much to the boy's horror as he suddenly found out that he was basically considered Wizarding Jesus. None of the reports seemed to notice it when Harry slipped past them with Nick, thanks to him hiding behind Hedwig's cage as they boarded the train. As a result, unlike in the book, there was still plenty of rooms empty in the train that they could set up in. Nick chose a room at the back of the train that was seriously out of the way to see if the events of the story would still happen despite his intervention. Lo and behold, one nervous redhead with freckles peeked his head in the doorway just before the train set off. Nick noticed that the boy in question immediately locked onto Harry's forehead, or more specifically his scar, before he asked if he could sit in with them. Nick acted like he didn't care, so Harry agreed and let Hedwig out of her cage so he could store it overhead to make room. The bird calmly settled on the seat next to Nick once she got a nod from him and stared at Ron. The red-headed boy held out his hand to Nick after noticing he seemed to have the most authority in the room. "I'm Ron Weasley," he introduced himself casually. Nick shook the boy's hand firmly but not hard. "Nicholas Iron, and you already know my friend next to you," he said with a knowing smirk. Harry looked confused for a moment before he realized that his identity had already been seen through by Ron and sighed. Yeah, that's Harry Potter, isn't it?" Ron asked sheepishly for confirmation. "I am. Yes and no, I don't remember anything about that night," Harry said, basically cutting off any awkward questions immediately. Nick had told him that should he be exposed, that saying that would save him a lot of time. It was true too, as Ron looked like a goldfish for a moment, opening and closing his mouth trying to think of something to say, but he had nothing. "Chill, mate, just treat him like anyone else and you'll be fine," Nick said helpfully, letting Ron sigh in relief. "I thought you'd be, I don't know, awesome looking, I guess," Ron says honestly to Harry, who looked confused. "Why?" he asked curiously. "Propaganda mostly," Nick said calmly, and Ron thought about it for a minute but nodded in agreement. "Yeah, they made all sorts of stories about how you were raised by dragons and went on loads of adventures and stuff like that. Thought most of it was malarkey but didn't know really, no one does," Ron said honestly. Harry groaned. "You never said it was this bad, Nick," he complained loudly, making Ron look confused. Nick noticed this and chuckled before explaining how he had warned Harry about his fame, but he didn't believe him all the way. "How did you know? Weren't you raised by muggles? After all, there is no pure-blood family called Iron," Ron asked confused. "Flourish and Blots has an entire section filled with stories about Harry here. I saw it when we went to get our school supplies," Nick said honestly without actually answering the question, merely stating facts that sound like an answer. Chapter 31, Ferrets and Pranks. Ron quickly got comfortable with Harry and Nick and was chatting about all sorts of topics from Quidditch to favorite flavor every flavor bean. It was clear that he didn't seem to understand how anyone couldn't know about these things, so Nick had to explain how the Muggle world was totally different than the Wizarding world. Ron seemed to figure it out pretty quickly and was more than happy to explain about all of the things he could think of. Both Nick and Harry listened closely to these explanations and interjected when they felt more details were needed. The most interesting thing that Nick found out about was that while there were other magical communities across the globe, very little information was exchanged between them. This was not just a language thing either, as traditions were massively different in each one as well. An example of this was how in India parcel mouths were widely respected and praised while most English wizards considered those who spoke the language of snakes as dark or evil. Ron apparently and biasedly assumed that the Indian magical community were the ones in the wrong. Neither Harry nor Nick corrected him as it was clear he was well and truly set in his ways. The train finally started moving 30 minutes later during a conversation on the topic of Muggle products versus wizard ones. It was getting pretty heated too as Nick insisted that Muggle products were equal to wizarding ones while Ron refused to accept it. It wasn't an angry discussion but both sides were trying their best to sway the other side with Harry figuring it was best to stay out of it. This changed when one Draco Malfoy showed up with his 2 followers clearly having been looking for Harry if the way he locked onto him was any indication. "You must be Potter, Draco Malfoy heir to House Malfoy, this is Crabbe and Goyle and future Slytherin," the pale blonde boy said arrogantly before seeing Ron and scoffing derisively. "You would do well picking your company better rather than sitting with blood traitors," he said, and Ron looked about 2 seconds away from throwing hands when Harry spoke up. "I'm good, thanks." Malfoy figured out that Harry had rejected him and merely scowled before leaving angrily. "Slimy git!" Ron cursed angrily after Draco left. "Doesn't seem like good company at all, he didn't even greet me," Nick said jokingly, which calmed Ron down a bit. "Want to see something interesting?" Nick said mischievously with a grin. Ron and Harry looked interested. "Watch this," Nick said before getting up and opening the door before leaning out, wand in a hand. Lang lock. Lang lock. Lang lock. 3 green spells flew out of his wand and as if expertly aimed struck Draco and his minions in the backs, making them stumble in surprise. Before they could look back to figure out who attacked them, Nick was already back in the room with the door closed. "Bloody hell, what was that?" Ron asked, amazed at the show of magic, not even caring that Nick had attacked Malfoy and his minions. "Lang lock, or the tongue-tied hex." Draco seemed to like to hear his own voice, and unless someone helps him he won't be able to for a few hours, Nick said with a laugh. Both Ron and Harry laughed once they also understood that Nick had just pranked Malfoy good. "Where'd you learn that from?" Ron asked excitedly. "The Defense Against the Dark Arts book, it's completely harmless and easy to get rid of but good fun against a loud mouth," Nick explained honestly, and the redhead dug out his book to look for the spell. Harry also looked over Ron's shoulder to try and learn the spell in question since it seemed pretty fun. Once they found the spell they started to practice it with some pointers from Nick to make it easier to pick up. Within an hour of this they both could cast the spell but still needed a bit of a wind-up, unlike Nick. At that point they were both quite hungry, and as if summoned by their stomachs the food cart reached them. Ron awkwardly said that he was good and pulled out a crushed sandwich from his pocket. Nick and Harry both shared a look and grinned. "We'll take one of each," they said at the same time with smiles, and pulled out 7 galleons each that was left over from not needing to buy their wands. Ron decisively tossed the sandwich out the window when offered to join in on the treat feast. Much like normal, the chocolate frog card Harry got was Dumbledore, but this time Nick kept it along with his own frog card with Ignatia Wildsmith, the creator of the Floo network. Chapter 32, Train Ride and Arriving at Hogwarts. Nick came up with a game to pass the time involving the every flavored beans that they had that was loads of fun. He called it Blind Man's Luck, and the way it worked was that one of the people not playing this round set out 4 beans. The people playing, however, had to have their eyes closed and guess a color. The first person to guess a color that was on a bean had to declare themselves a lucky blind man and randomly grab a bean and eat it. If it was a pleasant flavor they got a point and a new bean was added, and the game went on again until someone reached 3 points. If it was a bad flavor, however, that person lost a point instead, and if they reached -3 points, lost. The fist round was between Nick and Harry since Ron didn't quite understand how to play and needed a demonstration. Nick won with a total of 5 points won but 2 lost, and Harry won 4 points total but lost 2 as well before Nick got his needed 3. After that it rotated between the 3 of them, with all of them losing as well as winning. This ended when they simply didn't have any more beans left to play with. "That was bloody brilliant, mate. I had loads of fun," Ron said with a wide smile since he had the most wins. Nick and Harry both agreed that it was a fun little game to play with friends. The sun had already begun to set by the time the train parked in Hogsmeade Village, and they left their luggage on the train since they were assured it would be sent to their rooms after they are sorted. "My brothers told me that we had to fight a troll to get sorted," Ron said worriedly as they were getting off the train. Nick was distracted, however, as he saw in the distance several carriages pulled by pale skeletal horse-like creatures with white eyes and wings, thestrals. Invisible to all but those who have seen and understood death, and they were staring at Nick just as he them. It was unusual for Nick as he found it hard to understand, but he felt a sort of kinship with the creatures and it was hard to ignore. "Probably because I have died before," He thought seriously before focusing his attention back on heading over where Hagrid was calling the first years. Harry, Ron, and Nick ended on the boat with the half-giant, which made all of them nervous as the boat was only just out of the water. At least none of them fell out of the boats like Neville, who was saved by the friendly giant magical squid living in the lake. Nick had a sneaking suspicion that it wasn't actually a squid but rather a kraken. However, unless he could get someone to verify that idea, he doubted he would ever actually learn the truth of the matter. He thought it was funny when Hagrid said to watch their heads when they passed under an alcove to the docks that was well above their heads sitting down. The only person who had to duck was the half-giant himself. Once docked, the nervous first years followed after Hagrid as he began to make the short trek from the docks to the huge castle in the short distance. Nick found it hard to accurately describe exactly how big the school actually was, as he couldn't even see the entirety of it at once. At minimum it was easily 3 times bigger than the Roman Colosseum in size, and that didn't even include the 7 towers that, as the name implies, towered over the rest of the building that was by Muggle standards easily 6 stories tall. Hogwarts is fucking massive. I wonder what secrets yet remain undiscovered. Nick thought in awe as he shuffled behind Hagrid like the rest of the first years. Soon the man led them to outside the grand hall, where a tall, stern-faced older witch with graying brown hair and green eyes stood calmly. "I've brought the first year's Professor McGonagall," Hagrid said calmly, and McGonagall nodded. "I shall take it from here, Hagrid. You may join the others inside," she said calmly, and the big man did precisely that. McGonagall addressed the first years after that, telling them to form nice even lines and to go in and wait for their names to be called to be sorted. She somehow convinced a bunch of 11-year-old children to do exactly what she said and stand in lines like robots as the rest of every year students looked at them eagerly, trying to figure out where they are going to go. Chapter 33, Sorting. Everyone watched as Dumbledore looked over the new years, with his gaze briefly stopping on Harry and Nick before moving on to the rest. "Soon you shall all be sorted into your houses and begin your journey to magical mastery. Those in your house shall be your friends, your family, and your classmates for the next 7 years. I welcome you all to Hogwarts and wish each of you a happy next 7 years." The old man said loudly before stepping down to give McGonagall the floor to speak. "When your name is called, sit upon the stool and wait to be sorted before joining your house's table," she said succinctly. On the empty stool just in front of the professor's table, an old leather hat that had clearly seen better days was placed carefully by the woman before a face made of wrinkles formed on it, and it began to sing. "Oh, you may not think I'm pretty. But don't judge on what you see. I'll eat myself if you can find a smarter hat than me. You can keep your bowlers black. Your top hat sleek and tall. For I'm the Hogwarts sorting hat and I can cap them all. There's nothing hidden in your head the sorting hat can't see. So try me on and I will tell you where you ought to be. You might belong in Gryffindor, where dwell the brave at heart. Their daring, nerve and chivalry set Gryffindors apart. You might belong in Hufflepuff, where they are just and loyal. Those patient Hufflepuffs are true and unafraid of toil. Or yet in wise Ravenclaw if you've a ready mind, where those of wit and learning will always find their kind. Or perhaps in Slytherin you'll make your real friends. Those cunning folks use any means to achieve their ends. So put me on. Don't be afraid. And don't get in a flap. You're in safe hands, though I have none, for I'm a thinking cap." The hat finished its song and everyone clapped in appreciation of the interesting spectacle. McGonagall brought out a list and began the sorting. Abbott, Hannah. There was a few people who went before Nick, including Hermione, who, like she did in the story, chose Gryffindor as her house. When it was finally Nick's turn, he approached the stool calmly and sat down as the hat was placed on his head. How unusual. Normally those who sit here are unaware of their place in the world and need my help to find it. You though are not only aware of your place in the world but also know of my own dilemma. As you think you could thrive in any of the other houses equally, which truly only leaves your own opinion as the tie-breaker, but choose wisely, for you may never change your answer," the hat said before going silent and leaving Nick to think about his choice one last time. The professors were surprised when 5 minutes passed and yet no house was called, but they weren't unaware of what was happening as it had happened before. Events like this were known as hat stalls and usually happened when a student was suited for more in a single house equally. Only Dumbledore was nervous about the outcome of the stall, as it might force him to change his plans. In the end, Nick decided that his original choice was the best, and the hat finally yelled out Gryffindor, sealing the deal forever. Nick's robes shifted to the gold and red of his new house and he walked over to his house's table under the congratulations of the other students. Nick thought it was funny how the 2 resident pranksters Fred and George Weasley tried to filch greed as a joke and ended up with Fred having a bite mark on his hand after it shifted into a zombified version of George's face. Neither seemed to take it personally, as they could tell it was just a defensive prank on Nick's part. You gotta show us how you got it to do that, mate. George said excitedly, and even Fred agreed despite how bothered by what he saw he was. Nick shrugged. You guys know about boggets? He asked with a smirk. The two older boys think for a moment before figuring out why he asked that. It turns into someone's fear before attacking, they said at the same time excitedly. Nick chuckled at their synergy but nodded in agreement. Yeah, the enchantment works like a boggart when it seems like someone is trying to steal from me, he explained with a knowing smirk. The twins looked sheepish at being called out but could tell Nick wasn't angry at them and came clean about how they noticed his ring changing shape all the time he was getting sorted and were curious. Chapter 34, Slight Change and Food. To be honest, I am more surprised that so few people have noticed it, Nick said honestly. The twins shared a look. Don't take this the wrong way, mate, but it's hard to look at anything other than your face, Fred said seriously, which confused Nick. Why? He asked curiously. It's that wicked scar you got on your forehead and those eyes, mate, they're hard to look away from, George said honestly. I can get the scar, but what's so interesting about my eyes? Nick asked confused. The twins shared another look. We thought you could tell us, mate, they are golden, like a hawk, they said at the same time. Nick frowned when he heard this, as he had assumed it might have something to do with his wand and current location. Just like the wizard, its bonded to wands grow alongside their wielders, and very rarely this manifests as an external feature. Usually it's a very small change, like a slight shift in the tiniest parts of a wizard's eye, like with how Dumbledore has the tiniest bit of phoenix-like eyes. Nick thought that because of how special his wand was and how much pure magical energy was in Hogwarts, his eyes must have made an almost instant flip in color when he arrived. The worst part was that he was certain that this change was permanent too, since it was based on his connection to his wand. Nick could only tell the truth and say he has no idea, and try and change the subject by dangling the offer to get similar rings in front of the twins. They noticed his reluctance to talk about his eyes further and willingly took the bait he offered them and promised to hash out the details later. The sorting ceremony was still ongoing, which is why the conversation was cut short, but Nick didn't mind. Much like he expected, Harry also got put in Gryffindor, which created a whole ruckus from the house, who were excited to have Wizarding Jesus. Ron also got put in Gryffindor as well, but honestly speaking, Nick wouldn't put it past the hat to pull a fast one and send him to Hufflepuff for his loyalty. Even in the books, Ron never truly abandoned his friends despite falling out with them a few times, which proved his loyalty. Once the sorting was done, Dumbledore took to the podium again and began to speak. I have a few start of term notices I wish to announce. Please note that the forest is strictly forbidden to all students. Also, our caretaker Mr. Filch has asked me to remind you that the third floor corridor on the right side is out of bounds to everyone who does not want to die the most painful death. With all of that said, I have said enough and will leave you to your meal with 4 words. Nitwit. Blubber. Oddment. Tweak. He said, and food appeared on the tables in copious amounts. Nick curiously grabbed the cup near him and took a sip of the orange-colored juice in it, but grimaced. Pure pumpkin juice tastes a bit weird. Should add some vanilla, honey, and cinnamon to it, he muttered, and much to his surprise the liquid vanished for a moment before returning with a slightly darker color. Tasting it again, he found the liquid to now taste like pumpkin pie in a cup, which was totally fine by him. Thanks, he muttered to what he assumed was the house elves eavesdropping on the students to fix any complaints they had. The food was fantastic and varied, but mostly English in origin, which bothered Nick a bit, as he kinda wanted some tacos. He voiced this and grinned as moments later 6 supreme tacos appeared in front of him, and if he had been looking at the professor's table, Dumbledore as well. The old wizard had been paying close attention to Nick since he appeared, and as a result was aware of the new ring he was wearing as well as what it seemed to do. After their last encounter, the headmaster had looked into Nick's background and was surprised to learn that he seemed to appear out of thin air one day a few months ago. He had even asked Ollivander what wand the young man had been matched with and was surprised at the answer. Hagrid vouched for the boy, however, so Dumbledore didn't let his own worries tempt him into doing something rash. When Nick was sorted into Gryffindor, the old wizard breathed a sigh of relief and lowered his vigilance of the boy a fair amount. So when the headmaster noticed Nick specifically asking the house elves for things, he curiously asked to receive the same and was delighted he did. They were delicious. Chapter 35, Exploration. The main part of the feast went on for 30 minutes before the final part, featuring desserts of all kinds, began, though most were full by this point. Nick sneakily stored away several tarts and cookies in greed for later and didn't notice how Dumbledore had trouble not laughing when he saw his actions. It was a childish action that earned a bit of goodwill from the old wizard and gave him snacks for the next few days, though he only knew about the second part. This didn't mean that the old goat hadn't noticed the bird-shaped ring on Harry's finger this entire time, however. Once the feast was over, the prefects of each house lead the first years to their dorm rooms, where they were told how to get in, as well as a few obvious ground rules like no entering the opposite sex's bedrooms. There were a few others, but those were common sense things like not stealing from housemates and the like. After that was taken care of, the first years were effectively cut loose to do whatever they wanted, though they needed to stay in the common room because of the 9 o'clock curfew. So ya ickle firsty, let's talk shop, shall we? Fred and George showed up to grab Nick while Harry and Ron watched dumbfounded. The twins dragged him over to a private corner of the common room. So, what ya want for him? They asked at the same time excitedly. Nick grinned predatorily and shook his head while patting them on the shoulders. It's not about what I want, but rather what you can give me, understand? He said calmly. Both of the twins suddenly felt like they were flies that had flown into a spider's web willingly. 30 minutes later, both of the twins left Nick looking like they had just waltzed with a dementor from how lifeless they looked. Nick, on the other hand, was beaming happily as Ron walked up to him. What did you do to them? He asked curiously. Nick chuckled. They wanted a service from me and made the mistake of offering a blank check. Which I gratefully used to the utmost degree, not to worry though, they aren't getting ripped off. He explained with a laugh. What did you ask for that made them look like that? Harry asked curiously. Nothing serious, just a small durable magic furnace. Nick said like it wasn't a hard to find item. Not expensive mind you, as it was fairly cheap at only 15 galleons, but since the list of people who would actually want such a thing is tiny, they are basically all made to order. How did Nick know this? Because it was in the system description of one in the shop that would cost him 3,000 points to get normally. Why the bloody hell would you ever want one of those? Ron asked in astonishment. Alright. I forgot you haven't been filled in yet. I'm a ringsmith. Made everything we have on our hands, in fact. Nick said, showing off Sanner and Greed. Your brothers wanted something like this one here. He pointed at Greed, and I needed the furnace to do my work without worrying about burning down the castle or running out of fuel. It's a win-win situation for everyone involved. The reason they looked like that though is because of how hard it is to get one of those furnaces. He explained honestly. Ron looked like he was about to ask for a ring of his own, but Nick immediately shot him down by explaining that he doesn't work for free unless it's a birthday or Christmas present, and pointed at Harry's ring that was a birthday gift. The redhead looked heartbroken but understanding nonetheless as he dropped the topic. They all turned in for the day after that, at which point they found out they were sharing a room with Neville Longbottom. The next day was Sunday, so they could go exploring the castle if they wished, which Nick very much did. There was no elf during this night's sleep, so Nick woke up feeling refreshed and ready to go nice and early at 7. No one else was up in the room, so he got dressed in his casual robes and casually took out an oatmeal cookie from Greed to snack on as he walked. He first fully explored the 3rd floor, that was the same one his common room was found on, minus the forbidden corridor, and checked the shortcut through the humpbacked witch statue that was there. He knew it was there from the books, but personally seeing it was something worth doing. Chapter 36, Rant, authors say. So I have been patient for the most part with my readers, but some of you, not many, have complained about a few things that I feel I need to address. First and foremost, I am writing in general as a hobby to entertain myself. This story is no exception. I put a poll down on my Patreon to choose the next story I wrote, and this one got the majority vote. I am not writing this story for money or anything like that. My Patreon was set up specifically so that anyone who joined it did so because they liked my stories and wanted to support me. The extra 5 chapters ahead of everyone else were my way of giving something back to them. This said, all these comments saying how bad my plot is or the way I wrote the story was wrong or weird or whatever are pointless. The story isn't meant to appeal to everyone, just me, and I am quite happy with it so far. Next up on my list of unreasonable complaints that I have been given is the length of my chapters. They are 800 words long every single time. They aren't short at all, they aren't getting shorter, and they don't need to be bigger since I post new stuff almost every day. After that is all the people complaining about the plot of the story and how it feels summarized or like it's skipping in places. It seems that way because it is in fact like that in some parts, and for good reason too. Reading about someone's boring everyday life where nothing interesting happens is just that, boring. I don't like writing it, and I certainly don't like reading it, and so I move time forward to a point that is actually worth noting. Next up is the complaints I have been getting about the way I write characters or simply haven't wrote characters. When I started this story, I boiled down the characters to their base elements. Harry was an insecure boy who was desperate to fit in, while Dumbledore was a manipulative, paranoid old man with good intentions. In a nutshell, this fit the characters to a T, since J.K. herself wrote them like this in her stories. All I did was adapt the characters to the situation of my own story and run with it. In regards to all the comments I have been getting about clichés or tropes, I feel the need to express that the story has barely even begun yet, and so I have to get all the annoying background details set up before it can really get to the exciting stuff. You know, things that seem pointless now but become important later, that background stuff? That's where those come from when I am writing the chapters. All of this said, I am not just venting my issues here at everyone. I truly do appreciate that others read my stories and enjoy them, and I even enjoy when people ask reasonable questions like, does his avian dominion apply to Thestrals or Velas? Things like that. It makes me happy to see people engaging with the story and trying to figure out what I am setting up for the future and what is actually just fluff. For everyone who isn't part of the groups this is targeted at, I apologize that you were subjected to this post and ask for your understanding. Chapter 37, Exploration, 2. Nick found the charms classroom as well as a few other nifty little things, like how there was a spot hidden behind a painting of a puppy in one of the unused classroom that you needed to move the ball in the painting to access. It was a small spot, but Nick figured it could be a good place to hide things he couldn't keep on him. The fourth floor was even more boring, as all he found was the history of magic classroom and the hospital wing without even a single secret passage that he could find despite trying for an hour, much to the amusement of the living portraits. The fifth floor was a bit more interesting, as Nick found the music room, the art room, the prefect's bathroom and the Muggle studies classroom. There were a few portraits, of course, since the things were almost everywhere in the castle. The greatest find, however, was the secret room he discovered by talking to the oldest of said portraits. It was accessed by twisting a certain torch to the right 90 degrees before pushing it up. This made the wall next to it fold inward to reveal the hidden room that was a right mess with webs and broken furniture everywhere. Otherwise, Nick thought it would be a perfect spot to do forbidden things if he felt the need. The sixth floor was the one that confused Nick to a degree, as it was totally normal other than the secret passageway to Filch's storeroom where he keeps all the things he confiscates. Nick was pretty sure this was how the twins stole the Marauder's map from the grumpy old squib. He moved on to the seventh floor that he knew without a doubt had something exciting. He found the divination classroom, a secret passage back to the third floor, and of course the room of requirement. When he reached the room, Nick immediately knew what he wanted from it without any issue. He paced back and forth in front of the tapestry of Barnabas, repeating the sentence, "I want all the lost money," in his head 3 times, causing a simple door to manifest on the blank wall next to the tapestry. Opening the door, Nick was surprised to see that there actually wasn't a lot of money in the room, merely a small pile about a foot tall. He asked the room to separate the coins by type, which was, he learned that most of them were bronze nuts, with silver sickles coming in second and golden galleons in last. In fact, there was only 62 galleons in the entire pile. He took everything, of course, since money was money, but he was hoping for more. It only dawned on him after collecting all the money into greed that the house elves probably collect most of the lost money and turn it into Dumbledore, so what he just got was probably only what they missed for whatever reason. He then left the room, causing the door to vanish as if it was never there to begin with, and then started to pace again. This time, however, he wanted all the lost magical metal objects, and boy did the room deliver big. Inside the room was a small mountain's worth of metal objects that were all made of magical metal. Most of it was everyday stuff like dragon steel that was literally just steel made with dragon flames. Magical, yes, useful, not really. He did get some of the good stuff though, like mithril, orichalcum, goblin silver, and even the extremely rare star metal. The good stuff was in the heavy minority, so it all just barely fit in greed without touching anything else in it, which told him it was time to go. Just the metals in his ring were worth a small fortune as is, and was way more valuable than the actual money he had collected. Since there was nothing really interesting on the 7th floor beyond what he had found, he left. The shortcut to the 3rd floor made reaching the 2nd floor a breeze for Nick, and he began to search the area thoroughly. He found the defense against the dark arts classroom as well as the headmaster's office and Moaning Myrtle's bathroom. As far as secret passages went though, this place was loaded with them, as there was a passage leading to literally every floor of the castle, multiple sometimes even. Nick was tempted to go and break into the Chamber of Secrets, but logic won out and he decided against it. The 1st floor had the arithmancy classroom, the ancient runes classroom, the library, and the dungeon's entrance. There were a few hidden paths here, but most of the secrets were fairly well known and used to get around easier for students. Chapter 38, Meeting New People. Nick met other first years at around this time that were also exploring the castle, like Terry Boot, both of the Paddle twins Padma and Parvati, who had somehow got put in separate houses, and even Daphne Greengrass. The last of which tried to ignore his existence as she passed him in the hallway, but Nick wouldn't be himself if he didn't try and get her attention. "Your hair looks nice. What soap do you use?" he asked while acting innocent. The cold brunette almost tripped from the shock that came from someone in Gryffindor talking to her who was in Slytherin. She was stuck between a rock and a hard place as she was both a pure-blood heiress from one of the sacred 28 and a member of Slytherin house. The real problem came in the form of her own personal beliefs that said there was nothing wrong with talking to a muggle-born like Nick since blood superiority was nonsense. Her best friend was a half-blooded witch after all and was just as talented as most other pure-bloods she had met. Horsetail, nettle, and lavender oil. She mumbled awkwardly before rushing away in embarrassment. Nick grinned widely at the interaction, taking it as a personal victory while also mentally taking note of the girl's answer since she really did have some nice-looking hair. Smooth and silky dark brown with a nice reflectiveness to it. An odd thing to notice perhaps, but Nick was a ringsmith, which required an extreme level of attention to detail. The Paddle twins were far more interested in the school itself than their surrounds, so he left them be. Terry Boot, however, was an oddball who actually sought Nick out once he saw him excitedly. "That's a cool ring you've got there, mate. What's it do?" the brown-haired boy asked while looking at Greed curiously. Nick was a bit surprised that the boy had noticed the ring, as he was the only student besides the twins who seemed to. "It's a storage ring that turns into what someone is most afraid of and attacks them if they try to steal it," Nick explained honestly, since there was no reason to hide it since it would be exposed eventually anyways. Terry smiled happily. "Cool. My da's an enchanter, so I was raised amongst enchanted items my whole life and I've never seen one like that ring," he explained eagerly. "Terry Boot, by the way." He held out his hand with a grin. Nick shook the offered hand with a grin of his own. "Nicholas Iron. I got the ring over the summer and it's one of my favorite enchantments so far," he said proudly. Clearly the person who made it took inspiration from Boggarts when they did. "Wouldn't doubt if it was goblin-made, honestly, vicious little buggers that they are," Terry said while admiring the ever-shifting ring. Nick chuckled awkwardly at this since he was the one who made it. "Ah. I almost forgot to catch up with Anthony, sorry to leave like this, Nick," Terry said suddenly as he remembered what he was doing before he saw Nick and left quickly, heading towards the direction of the library. "He seems interesting enough," Nick thought with a chuckle before he started to walk again. The landscape outside the windows was very picturesque as the sun reflected off the Black Lake and the Forbidden Forest stood ominously in the distance past the Quidditch pitch. Nick found himself alone eventually, and after double-checking that he truly was, he closed his eyes and extended his magical senses. Immediately he was overwhelmed as he felt a frankly absurd amount of magic around him, including a subtle bit of magic stuck to his clothes. Nick grit his teeth and tried to ignore the rest of the magic to focus on the charm attached to his robes to get a feel for its purpose. He felt that it wasn't cast with malicious intent in mind, but the spell itself was clearly a tracking one. Nick wasn't sure if all students had this on their clothes, but he could think of who might be behind it. The reason Nick hadn't been using the frankly crazy sensitivity to magic he had in the form of active sensing had to do with the backlash he got for doing so after getting off the train. The sheer amount of ambient magic around him caused his nose to start to bleed when he went to scan his surroundings, as he was used to doing at the orphanage. He could tell that it would take a while for his senses to adapt to this sudden spike in magic, and even this current use of them had his nose dripping red. Chapter 39, McGonagall and Snape. Nick stopped forcing the issue and held the wall for a moment as a wave of vertigo hit him. Once the world stopped spinning, he tentatively released the wall and felt his lip, where he found a small amount of blood. "N.E.N. Water," he said calmly in Elvish while pushing his wand forward, causing a small orb of pure water to appear in the air. With a careful movement of his wand, Nick moved the orb of water to his face, where he rinsed off the blood the best he could without a mirror. After he was done, Nick sent the water out a nearby window and left the area to continue his exploration of the castle. He found the Transfiguration classroom and, surprisingly enough, Professor McGonagall herself within it, enjoying a morning cup of tea. "Something I can help you with, Mr. Iron?" she asked, seeing him outside the classroom door. "Not at the moment, Professor. I was just exploring the castle to get my bearings is all, and noticed you within this room giving me pause," Nick answered both honestly and cordially. "How goes your progress so far?" the elderly witch asked curiously. "Splendidly, Professor. I have already cleared the 2nd to 7th floors from my list and only require this one and the dungeons to be fully aware of majority of the castle," he answered honestly. McGonagall raised an eyebrow in surprise at this, an impressive speed, I admit. "I expect you will have no trouble being on time for lessons come tomorrow then?" she asked seriously. Nick nodded with a grin. "Unless something unusual happens to delay me, I ought to be amongst the first to arrive from my housemates," he said confidently. The elderly witch had the smallest upturned corner of her mouth. "Very well, young man, I shall hold you accountable to that. Off you trot now," she said, waving him away dismissively. She wasn't half as stern as the books made her sound, though then again my interaction might be because I am neither in trouble nor in class. Nick thought as he left. He started to come across more and more people as time moved on and lunchtime arrived in the castle, and others seemed to realize they had no clue where the other classes were. He found the fruit bowl painting that apparently led to the kitchens and noted that it was right near the Hufflepuff common room that was hidden in a barrel by the wine cellar. The dungeons were past the wine cellar and led underneath the Black Lake apparently, which explained why the entire area was almost frigid in temperature. Architecture-wise very little was different than the rest of the castle save for a couple things. First was the noticeable uptick of snake motifs adorning practically everything. Second was the overabundance of disused prison cells because it was a dungeon of course. Finally however was the potions classroom and ingredient storage room not far from it. Nick noticed a lot of Slytherin students in this part of the castle and they definitely noticed him as well. "You there, Mudblood?" He heard an ever so irritating voice call out with an offensive word, and it took considerable willpower not to turn and use a hex on its owner. "What do you want, Malfoy?" Nick said, turning around with an irritated expression. The blonde boy froze momentarily as he found himself staring at Nick's golden eyes. "You see, I happened to spot you polluting the air down here and decided to do something about it." Malfoy quickly recovered and said loudly with a sneer. "By all means do go on, I'm sure Professor Snape would love to hear more, Malfoy," Nick said while looking at that same professor who had just rounded the nearby corner and saw them both. Malfoy turned to follow Nick's line of sight and could only grit his teeth and leave angrily, seeing that Snape was indeed standing there with his usual resting bitch face. Seeing that nothing happened, Snape seemed almost disappointed and chose to ignore Nick and walk into the potions classroom brutally. "That guy's got issues. Well, I'm done here anyways, so I guess I can spend the rest of the day in the library," Nick thought before leaving the dungeons and walking through the halls of the first floor to the library at the eastern portion of the castle. The library was an intimidating place for Nick, as not only was the librarian Irma Pans a stern woman who looked like she hated anyone who so much as touched her precious books, but the damned thing looked endless as Nick simply could not see an end to the rows of bookshelves. Chapter 40, Start of Classes. Nick wanted to pull his hair out in frustration when he saw the organization that the library had, which is to say basically none. There was once a semblance of order to the library, but clearly the past generations of librarians gave up on it, as Nick found fifth-year books in the second-year area and even a book on potions in the charms section. This didn't even begin to go into the books he found in the deeper parts of the library that had looked like they had seen the light of day within centuries, which may even be true. Books on rituals, sacrifices, magical crest, veritology, wand-making, and more hyper-advanced or dangerous subjects sat in plain view, making Nick think that the restricted section was a distraction. On the plus side, I will likely be way more knowledgeable than the past few generations of wizards, Nick thought as he grabbed a book called A Beginner's Guide to Rituals by R.S. Black. Rituals can roughly be categorized into 4 categories: sacrificial, obligatory, finite and fusion. Before I delve into these types of ritual in depth, I shall write a warning to whomever it may concern. Rituals are a precise art that broker no mistakes in their construction, for even a small deviation may have catastrophic consequences. You have been duly warned. Nick had a serious expression on his face as he read the entry excerpt for the book he had picked up, even though he had no clue what language it was in. Being able to read, write, and speak any language was already coming in handy for Nick, as a vast majority of books at Hogwarts were in dead or foreign languages. One of the books way back in this area had even been written in cuneiform as far as Nick could tell. The warning in the book had made him both curious as well as cautious, since he had no clue what he was looking at magically speaking. He severely lacked a lot of information on the magical side of the world and refused to delve into any extra topics until he fixed this problem. A good thing about this ancient section, as he decided to call it, was that he also found books on the basics of magic in these lost or foreign languages that he could use to expand his personal knowledge of both old and modern magical fundamentals. It was funny how hard a task becomes when the key information to it is locked behind a language barrier. Sure, if you have the talent and just enough information, you could slowly recreate what you need from scratch, but this was inefficient and it showed. 1,000 years ago, magical people on the level of Dumbledore were everywhere. They slowly vanished, however, as the generations went on and laziness and incompetence ran rampant until what was once common knowledge was considered obscure. Nick had a theory that the reason so many forbidden books were in the ancient section was because Dumbledore didn't actually know what they contained and as a result had overlooked them. More for me, I guess, Nick thought with a grin as he went to the normal sections to try and find normal fundamental books. By the time dinner came around at 6, he had found literally 2 books that covered fundamental knowledge. This'll have to do for now, I guess, he thought, depressed as he checked the books out under Ms. Pance's scowl. Dinner was the same as the night before, with the selection of food being noticeably English. with the exception of the tacos that had shown up on the table confusing and delighting the majority of the students. When dinner was done, all the first years got their schedules for the entire year posted on the board in the common room, and it was as follows. Mondays 7-8, 45 breakfast/9 to 10 potions/10, 15-11, 15 herbology/11, 15-12, 45 lunch/1 to 2 herbology/2, 15-6 free period/6 to 8 dinner. Tuesdays, 7-8, 45 breakfast/9 to 10 history of magic/10, 15-11, 15 charms/11, 15-12, 45 lunch/1 to 2 charms/2 to 6 free period/6 to 8 dinner. Wednesdays 7-8, 45 breakfast/9 to 10 flying/10, 15-11, 15 astronomy/11, 15-12, 45 lunch/1-2 defense against the dark arts/2-6 free period/6-8 dinner. Thursdays 7-8, 45 breakfast/9-10 dada/10, 15-11, 15 history of magic/11, 15-12, 45 lunch/1 to 2 transfiguration/2, 15-3, 15 transfiguration/3, 36 free period/6-8 dinner. Fridays 7-8, 45 breakfast/9-10 astronomy/10, 15-11, 15 charms/11, 15-12, 45 lunch/1-2 potions/2, 15-3, 30 potions/3, 36 free period/6 to 8 dinner. Saturdays and Sundays, free time. Chapter 41, Potions. Nick didn't mind the schedule as it was perfectly reasonable and even gave them plenty of free time. Most of the other first years in Gryffindor bellyached about having potions with Slytherin first thing on their first day. You know, if you just focus on your potions you should be fine, right? Nick said loudly so everyone could hear him. Everyone says Snape hates us Gryffindors though. Seamus Finnegan said, upset. Maybe he does, but if we don't give him a reason he can't exactly take off points, can he? Nick suggested, and everyone looked thoughtful for a moment before nodding in agreement. That said, you might want to look out, Harry. He's likely to pick on you a bit tomorrow unreasonably because you are famous. Nick said warningly. Harry looked aggrieved at being singled out, but he nodded in understanding anyways. I wonder how pissed the big bad bat is going to be when Harry answers those questions of his. Nick thought with a snicker as he suggested a study group to prepare for tomorrow, and most of his housemates agreed. Nick of course made it fun since normal studying wouldn't work on Gryffindors and played a game of 20 questions involving the potions book knowledge. A certain bushy-haired girl almost ruined the game, however, by trying to answer every question until Nick put a stop to that by implementing a 3-question spacing rule. It didn't stop the girl from perfectly answering every 4th question after that, but at least everyone else got a chance. It also kept her from getting the others as resentful at her for being an insufferable know-it-all. Honestly speaking, she may have preferred Ravenclaw with how she thinks. Nick thought while asking another tricky question involving aconite. Only Hermione seemed to realize that the only person who seemed to know all the answers to the questions was the person answering them, Nick. She found him unusual, as unlike her he seemed quite popular with their peers even though he was clearly just as knowledgeable as her. She simply couldn't understand how, no matter how much she watched his interactions with others. If she actually asked Nick, however, he would laugh and tell her that people aren't logical creatures who only want facts, and that the moment she stops treating them like that she'll be fine. The night ended without that conversation, of course, as Hermione was rather stubborn about learning by herself. Still, unlike in the story, the majority of first-year Gryffindor at least had a decent grasp on potions theory and ingredients now. Nick didn't doubt that Snape will likely look through their memories to figure out why and find Nick at the center of it. It's pointless if he does though, since Sanner makes gentle legilimency impossible, and unless he wants to get reported to the Ministry by a whole lot of witnesses, hard legilimency is also off the table. Nick thought smugly. Breakfast consisted of thick pancakes, sausage, and eggs with gravy for Nick to prepare him for the day while his classmates grew nervous of Snape's impending class. Nick made sure to arrive at the potions classroom before any of his Gryffindor housemates because he didn't doubt that McGonagall might actually hold him to his words. Angering a witch who could turn you into a literal doormat just seemed like a bad idea to Nick after all. More and more people started to pour into the room and divide themselves based on house, which irritated Nick a bit, so he decided to spice things up a bit and sit next to Daphne Greengrass mischievously. The girl in question looked incredulous while her best friend Tracy Davis merely raised an eyebrow at him with an intrigued expression. "Isn't this much more interesting?" Nick asked with a cheeky grin. "What about the others?" Tracy asked curiously. "Screw 'em, only those I decide are important can suggest how I live my life. Nick said firmly. Both the girls were surprised to hear this answer, but both smiled and nodded in agreement. Nicholas Iron and I look forward to working alongside you both. Nick said humbly. Tracy Davis, likewise. Tracy said, and Daphne said quietly, Daphne Greengrass, likewise. And so Nick had firmly made acquaintances with the pair of Slytherin girls. Harry, Ron, and Hermione ended up working together like in canon as a result, though Ron looked unbelievably conflicted when he saw Nick chatting with the two Slytherin girls peacefully. Soon enough the time for class came and Snape walked in with his black robes dragged behind him with a menacing look. He took roll call but paused at Harry's name. Ah, yes. He said softly, Harry Potter. Our new celebrity. Malfoy and his minions snickered. Chapter 42, Potions, 2. You are here to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion making, he began, but even speaking barely louder than a whisper everyone heard him clearly. As there is little foolish wand waving here, many of you will hardly believe this is magic. I don't expect you will really understand the beauty of the softly simmering cauldron with its shimmering fumes, the delicate power of liquids that creep through human veins, bewitching the mind, ensnaring the senses. I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, even stopper death if you aren't as big a bunch of dunderheads as I usually have to teach. Everyone was silent, enraptured by his speech. Potter. He said suddenly, calling out Harry. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? He asked seriously. Draught of living death, sir. Harry said respectfully and honestly. Snape was caught off guard that Harry knew the answer but quickly recovered. Where would you look if I asked you to find me a bezoar? He asked calmly. In a goat, sir. Harry answered, again catching the man off guard. Final question, Potter, between Monk's Hood and Wolfsbane? He asked, much less confrontational now. They are the same thing, Professor, Aconite. Harry said still respectfully. Snape grunted slightly before glaring at the rest of the class. Well, why aren't you writing that down? He asked angrily, but Nick noticed the man shooting him a glance before flinching away when Sanner ripped up his legilimency threads. Nick didn't antagonize the professor but focused on copying the potion recipe for a cure for boils that was on the nearby board. Nick noticed that the recipe was different than the one in the book and guessed that Snape had modified it to be better than the original. Snape noticed what Nick was doing but didn't say anything about it, since if he could recognize the value of the information he might actually deserve to be in the class. On the board is the recipe to the cure for boils. I expect a finished product to be turned in at the end of class. Snape said, and all the students minus Nick got up to collect the ingredients for the potion. Snape smirked ever so slightly when he saw what Nick was doing instead, preparing his work area thoroughly. Snape would need to be blind not to see the clear signs of talent for the craft in Nick, and so chose to ignore him entirely. The two girls partnered with Nick brought back a full set of perfect ingredients, which didn't surprise him at all. Nick knew the Greengrass family owned most of the potion ingredient farms in the British Isles after all, and so Daphne as the heir should be very familiar with what is good quality. Nick got the potion started by filling the cauldron about halfway with water while the girls began to prepare the first ingredient, 6 snake fangs. Once the fangs were powdered, Nick checked the quality and had them grind them again since they were too coarse. Once the fangs were finely ground, he added 4 measures of the powder to the bubbling water and heated the mixture to 250 degrees for 10 seconds. He then waved his wand over the cauldron to stabilize the mixture before sitting down to wait 30 minutes. How are you so good at this? Aren't you a Muggleborn? Tracy asked quietly since they needed to wait. Nick chuckled. Purebloods don't have a monopoly on talent and hard work, sadly the second of those seems particularly lacking. He said honestly. Both of the girls were astonished at Nick's answer, as he had basically shot down the idea of blood superiority openly, and the worst part was that he simply wasn't wrong. Both pureblood and Muggleborn wizards were easily noticed to have equal amounts of talent. But unlike the Muggleborns who put in the work to catch up, the purebloods stagnated from laziness, thinking that the Muggleborns simply couldn't surpass them. Anyone with eyes could see this, and as a member of the Grey faction of the Wisengamot, the Greengrass family knew this as well. Stick with me and I'll show you what happens when talent and hard work joining together in a Muggleborn can do. Nick said confidently. The two girls couldn't help but being curious what Nick would accomplish in the future if he was as talented as he implied. Charisma is a funny thing that could draw others to someone or damn them to a hellish existence if one didn't have it, and oh did Nick have it in spades. He spoke and you just couldn't help yourself from listening, completely unaware that you were now caught in his own gravity. Chapter 43, New Friends. The group chatted about themselves quietly as they waited for the first step of the potion to finish. Nick explained about his amnesia and how he didn't actually care if he actually was a Muggle-born or not, which is why he had chosen not to take the Gringotts test. You aren't even a little curious, for all you know you could be the long-lost descendant of Merlin or something. Tracy said, not understanding his thinking. Nick shrugged. It's simply no fun to just have everything given to you because of your bloodline. I'd rather earn it all with my own effort and become the next Merlin instead. He said proudly. Oh? Rather lofty goal you have there, don't you think? Daphne asked, having become more comfortable around him. Not at all, the way I see it I have the rest of my life to reach that point, so I have plenty of time, assuming I don't get done it early of course. Nick said with a confident smile. They chatted a bit more about themselves and Nick learned about the blood malediction that had been cast on the Greengrass family 400 years ago that they have been searching for a cure of this whole time. This reminded Nick of the ancient section of the library that may in fact contain books on that exact topic if he were to look hard enough. He very much doubted that a spell used 400 years ago wouldn't be found within the 1,000-year-old library. If anything, the spell might have been found in the library by the person who used it. If it comes down to it, I could just make her a ring that cleanses evil magic from the body. Hopefully I'll be able to reach the skill needed to do so by Christmas. Nick thought while still holding the conversation. Tracy turned out to be in the pitiful position of her family being sworn to serve Daphne's, and as a result they had grown up together and were best friends. She wasn't angry at this situation since it honestly made little difference to her since she was friends with Daphne. The conversation needed to be cut short, however, when Nick noticed a subtle change in the coloration of the potion and moved on to the next step of brewing it, adding 4 horned slugs. He stirred the potion once hard to get the mixture nice and even before removing the cauldron from the fire and adding the porcupine quills to the cauldron with a gap of 2 seconds between each. He then stirred the now dark blue mixture counterclockwise 5 times with each lightening the color slightly until the final potion was plain blue. He waved his wand over the potion to seal in the remnant magic, causing pink smoke to rise from the cauldron, signifying a successfully brewed potion. Snape also noticed this since he had been keeping an eye on Nick after he showed promise. The 2 Slytherin girls were nervous seeing Snape walk over to their table but were left with gaping mouths when he smelled the smoke and a ghost of a smile appeared on his face. An acceptable potion, 5 points to Gryffindor and Slytherin each. The man said before leaving their table while every other student gaped at their table. Not only had they completed the potion first, but even Snape was impressed enough to give Gryffindor points. Hermione was practically steaming mad that she had been outdone and urged Harry and Ron to hurry up. Unlike in the book, Neville didn't make the mistake of leaving the potion on the fire before adding the porcupine quills, so he managed to create a barely passing potion. Soon enough the class came to an end, with those who failed to brew a passing potion needing to write an essay on the potion as homework. Those who did create passing potions were allowed to take a bottle of their own brewed potion with them. The rest was all mixed together by Snape and then donated to the hospital wing as reserves. This was actually pretty smart on the school's part, as it taught the students and prepared it to treat the pimple hexes that always showed up. The entire class had herbology next till 11, which was lunchtime, and then they had to come back to herbology till 2. After that it was a free period until dinner, which was like all meals, optional at Hogwarts. Nick no sooner left the potions classroom with Daphne and Tracy than Ron showed up with Harry and weirdly enough Hermione, who definitely didn't belong in the group yet. "How can you sit with these bloody snakes?" Ron asked angrily. Chapter 44, Difference in Worldview. "Now that's quite the rude thing to say, Ron. There's nothing slimy about these 2 girls," Nick said calmly, which tipped Harry off that something was wrong. Nick was a joking and grinning individual most of the time, and he only spoke calmly when he was angered. It was terrifying to Harry, as he understood getting loud and unreasonable when angry, but going calm instead sent chills down his spine. "You know what I mean. No one in Slytherin is ever a good person," Ron said, turning as red as his hair while Tracy and Daphne shifted uncomfortably behind Nick. "That is simply not true, and I can prove it. Merlin himself was part of Slytherin as well as many other famous wizards. What you are talking about is personal bias, not fact," Nick said calmly before leaving the redhead stuck in place as he tried to find a way to argue with what Nick said. Harry decisively sided with Nick on this particular argument and introduced himself to Daphne and Tracy. Hermione simply left without any input at all once she figured out that it was a pointless spat. The 2 Slytherin girls separated from Nick and Harry since they didn't want to sit at another house's table and get stared at by the entire thing. "You all right?" Harry asked as they sat down at the long table. "Yeah, I'm fine, Harry, just didn't expect to have to expose him so soon," Nick said with a sigh. Harry looked confused. "What do you mean?" he asked. "The guy's a sheepmate, his opinions aren't his but rather things he's picked up from his surroundings. Rumors say that most dark wizards come from Slytherin, so he thinks all Slytherin are evil. Get it? Nick said while skewering a sausage in frustration. Harry thinks about for a moment and then compares what he's seen of Ron and has to admit that the idea fits. Ron is never the one who starts anything on his own but rather seems to be following everyone else's lead. Does that mean he only hangs out with me because I'm famous? Harry asked with a sad expression that hurt to look at. Nick sighed but nodded at the moment. Yes, while he may hang out with you for genuine reasons, eventually he is just here for your fame at the moment. Nick said honestly, and he could see the hurt in Harry's eyes. Cheer up, mate, I was here before all this fame nonsense and I'm not going anywhere. Nick said, and Harry did brighten up a bit hearing this. Ron eventually sat at the Gryffindor table but avoided making eye contact with Nick, which worked just fine for him. Nick made sure that Harry wasn't late to the second portion of herbology by leaving at about 12:30 since they ate plenty fast to fill up before leaving. They arrived at the greenhouses that the class was set to begin at, and Nick shared some of the secrets he had found when he went exploring the castle yesterday. Tracy and Daphne joined them 5 minutes later and were surprised at the topic of conversation. So you found the kitchens? Tracy asked eagerly. She likes to get late-night snacks and has been complaining about it since we got here. Daphne explained with a sigh. Hey! Don't act like you don't share them with me. Tracy said defensively, and Nick and Harry both laughed at them. Yeah, the kitchens are pretty close to the dungeons actually, so you'd have a good chance of raiding them without getting in trouble, not like the house elves will mind. Nick said with a chuckle. Really? Where are they? We looked all over yesterday and didn't find it. Tracy said honestly. Okay, so do you know the large painting that looks like a fruit bowl near the wine cellar? Nick asked with a grin. You're kidding, right? Daphne asked in disbelief. Nope, if you tickle the pear it turns into a handle that can be pulled to let you in the kitchens. It's a bit creepy, to be honest. Nick said with a slight shiver. Ugh, we passed right by that painting like 4 times yesterday. Tracy complained. Not hard to understand why, I had to ask one of the other paintings to figure it out myself. Nick said with a shrug. Wait, you can do that? Daphne asked in surprise. Nick laughed. Of course you can, hell, most of the time the paintings are just happy for the conversation since it can be kinda boring just sitting on the wall all day. He said honestly. We will definitely check that out later. Tracy said happily. Professor Sprout showed up right after she said that and greeted the group with a smile and a cheery disposition. Chapter 45, Knowledge and Plans. Class started right at 1 and no one was late, surprisingly enough, though Neville did cut it close. Welcome back to Herbology, children, where I will show you the wondrous world of plants. Be warned though that magical plants are far different than those mundane ones and will punish you if you aren't careful. Professor Sprout said without losing her smile at all. Today we will start you out nice and easy with some simple plants like devil's snare, she said, pointing her wand towards a vine-like plant in a pot covered by shadows. Lumos. She said, and a bright light came from her wand's tip and illuminated the shadowy plant that visibly and quickly recoiled away from it. You see, devil's snare is a simple plant that hates light or fire and is well known to strangle anything it catches to death. She said before dispelling the spell and letting the plant relax. The rest of the class was spent after that learning all about various plants like the devil's snare, and Nick and Harry were understandably in need of taking notes. Daphne and Tracy were right at home in the greenhouse though, which made sense. The events of lunch happened after that and Harry was no longer in a great state of mind, which the two girls left alone. The second portion of herbology was just as info-cramming as the first part and thus didn't need much explanation. Harry and Nick said goodbye to the girls before Harry left for the common room and Nick headed for the library. Let's see what I can find out in these books, he thought as he took the 2 fundamental magic books out of greed. The books were fairly dry content-wise as they basically just explained things much like a textbook. Nick had expected this, however, and kept reading anyways since he needed as much knowledge as he could get. Nick had chosen the library to read these books due to the fact that very few of his housemates from the same year would be there. A certain bushy-haired girl was roaming the aisles in search of knowledge, but Nick ignored her since she was an exception. Nick finished one book 3 hours later and rubbed his forehead while stretching. I would really prefer to be forging right now, but I seriously need this information. Nick thought with a headache from all the theories and laws now floating in his head. Magic was stupidly complex despite what many would assume and required an in-depth knowledge of a lot of things that don't seem important at first. An example of this was the law of depletion that stated that when a spell was cast the energy wasn't lost but merely dispersed into the atmosphere. In most cases this information served no purpose, but in the tiny chance that something required a space with no foreign magic, it meant that all spell casting was forbidden. As it just so happened, a few potions required precisely such a circumstance and as a result were considered very difficult to brew. Well, not for me. Nick thought with a smirk before putting the book he completed back on a shelf. I have an hour until dinner, not enough to go through this other book it seems. Nick thought as he looked at the clock nearby. The book was placed into greed before he stood up and left the library. Nick made his way to one of the disused classrooms on the third floor to see if any of them might work as a workshop. There was a few reasons for this choice of his when the room of requirement could work as a good place to work instead. First was the close proximity of Professor Flitwick's office that meant that very few people would try and cause trouble. Despite his small stature, the man was a highly respected teacher as well as accomplished duelist. What Nick was counting on, however, was the goblin blood flowing through his blood. Goblins greatly respected craftsmen, and Nick hoped that the good professor had enough goblin nature in him to zealously guard the workshop. The second reason was because of suspicion, or rather to prevent it from forming. Nick doubted that him vanishing almost every day without any trace wouldn't draw unwanted attention. By having a place that is publicly known as his workshop solves this problem, since he will be easily findable most of the time. This also tied into the final reason for this choice: business. Nick was planning to set up shop in the room for anyone to come and order an enchanted ring from him. The reason he needed to do this was that he would need the publicity as a well-known enchanter to pass off his agelessness as a property of one of his rings, much like Flamel passed his off to the stone. Chapter 46, Leaving an Impression. Nick got lucky and found a medium-sized classroom 2 doors away from the charms classroom that was filled with unused desks. Nick checked the room thoroughly to make sure there weren't any nasty hidden things in it before nodding contentedly. He pointed his wand at the desk nearest him and spoke Wingardium Leviosa. And the desk rose up, at which point he pointed the wand at one desk after another, causing them all to float. Nick felt his magic reserves quickly emptying, and he waved his wand, send the desks floating towards the far wall where they were stacked neatly. A splendid use of the levitation charm. A higher pitch voice than normal said appreciatively from behind Nick, making him flinch and turn around quickly. There, at about 2 feet tall, was the very professor he chose this classroom for. It's very rare to see a first year perform multiple levitations at the same time, much more so when I haven't even taught the charm yet. Flitwick said with a happy smile. I actually learned all the spells in the book over the summer. Nick admitted awkwardly. Not to worry, my boy, I did the same thing when I was your age. The small man said honestly. I hope you'll forgive me for asking, but why were you rearranging this room to begin with? Flitwick asked curiously. I was planning to request this room to set up a workshop next week after getting comfortable with my class's workload. Nick said honestly. Oh? A workshop, you say? What sort of workshop? Flitwick asked, intrigued. Nick removed greed and handed it to the professor. I'm a ringsmith and I wanted to set up a workshop here at Hogwarts for my free time and maybe earn a bit of coin as well. Nick said with a grin. Flitwick rolled greed around on his palm, carefully observing it as it shifted constantly and unpredictably. What a fascinating piece of work, yours, I take it from your words. The small man asked, handing the ring back to Nick, who nodded. I took inspiration from Boggarts when crafting it, Nick said honestly. Flitwick nodded. A pretty good way to dissuade people from trying to steal from you, if a bit cruel. He said sternly. Nick raised his hands in surrender. Purely defensive on this piece, I promise. He said honestly. Very well, but how did you learn to enchant items? I don't recognize the method used here. The professor asked curiously. Nick scratched the back of his head awkwardly. It's my own personal method, it's one of the reasons the forging is so rough. Nick answered honestly. This surprised Flitwick, who looked at Nick carefully for any signs of deception but could only sigh when he found none. If it's no bother, I'd like to sit in on one of your crafting sessions to see what makes it so different from what I am familiar with. The professor said seriously. You would need to swear an oath or sign a contract not to share what you learn, but otherwise I don't mind much. Nick said after some thought. Flitwick was surprised to hear this but quickly agreed, since it was a pretty common practice meant to protect secrets from slipping out. In fact, most enchanters do something similar with their own apprentices that only allow them to share their knowledge with their own apprentices. This lets the art get passed on without getting passed out to the public. Nick definitely didn't want the Celebrimbor style reaching the public, since horrible things could be created with it in, say, Voldemort's hands. The charms professor was surprisingly knowledgeable about metalwork and even made suggestions on good alloys for carrying magic. Goblin silver and orichalcum, for example, made an alloy that was good for incredibly corrosive magics or things so powerful they would fall apart if placed on regular metals. Nick asked the small man if he would help him keep the noise from the work isolated by enchanting the door, to which he agreed. Nick got a few looks from all of the houses when he walked into the Great Hall for dinner alongside the professor in deep conversation about the best way to mix metals. It was probably hard for anyone not dedicated to a craft to understand where such passion came from, but the other professors minus Quirrell Elmore got it. Dumbledore caught bits of the conversation and could only give a wry smile as he knew more about the reason the conversation was likely happening than the rest. He had personally confirmed that Nick did indeed know his craft, and knowing Flitwick had been engaged in conversation on it for quite a while. Needless to say, Nick left quite the first impression on the first day of classes. Chapter 47, Teacher's Conversation. Flitwick reluctantly cut the conversation short when Nick reached Harry on the Gryffindor long table. The boy who lived had saved him a spot, and so the small professor could only promise to continue this conversation at a different time before joining the other teachers at their table with a wide smile. It would seem you have discovered the boy's knowledge of ring-making, Phileas. Dumbledore said meaningfully. Oh yes. He is positively bursting with potential with how knowledgeable he seems in the arts. I would have only found out much later if I hadn't caught him rearranging a disused classroom near my office, a truly splendid use of the levitation charm. Flitwick said excitedly. Oh? Don't you usually only start teaching that spell around Halloween? Dumbledore asked with keen interest. Flitwick nodded while setting a plate of food on his plate. Indeed, the boy said he's learned the entire year's worth of spells during the summer, and from the prowess he showed I believe it too. Flitwick said before biting into a sausage. It would seem the boy is full of surprises. Snape said calmly. What makes you say so, Severus? Dumbledore asked curiously. In my own class the boy not only had the foresight to copy my own personal cure for Boyle's recipe but even successfully improved it on the first try. The finished product was nearly a third more potent than my own. Snape said in a rare word of praise, much to the other professors' shock. And what of your class, Pomona? You had the boy the longest so far. Dumbledore asked, very much interested in the information. Well, he doesn't seem to have much affinity for plants if today's performance was any indication. Boy looked lost for most of my class. The plump woman said, disappointed. No need to be down, very few wizards have talents in all subjects, but we will need to keep a close eye on the boy to make sure he doesn't get led astray from his own talent like some of our school's past students. Dumbledore said darkly at the end of his statement, and the other teachers minus Quirrell Elmore nodded in agreement. Nick meanwhile was getting bombarded with questions by his housemates about what he was talking to Flitwick about. We were just talking about different types of metal and their potential in enchanting. Chill out. Nick said to get them to stop. Harry, Ron, and the twins understood why that made sense, but no one else did, so Dean Thomas fixed that. Why in Merlin's saggy robes would you be talking about that? He asked, confused, and almost everyone else nodded in agreement. I'm a ringmaker who works to shape and enchant metal while he's a master of charm, enchanting, and he's half goblin. Enough said. Nick said while showing off greed once again. He could show off Sanner instead, but greed is simply far more eye-catching to look at. Before anyone asks, I don't do work for free. If you want a ring you'll need to pay just like everyone else. Ask the twins, they can tell you. Nick said, causing most of them to deflate in disappointment, especially the girls. Fred and George laughed at the looks everyone had and shared their own experience making a deal with Nick and how they were having trouble fulfilling their side of it still. Apparently they had sent at least a dozen letters out trying to figure out where to get the furnace and hadn't heard back from any one of them yet. It doesn't really matter much anyways, since I won't be doing any work till next week at the least when I apply for a empty classroom for myself. Nick added, making the rest of the people who were still hopeful finally give up on trying to get some bling from Nick for now. Dinner was quiet after that as everyone mostly focused on eating. Most of the house went to bed after dinner with a few exceptions who decided otherwise. Nick was not amongst those as he wanted to be well rested for each of his classes tomorrow since they had charms and history of magic. Ron avoided both Nick and Harry even when they went to bed, which didn't bother either of them. The next morning Nick woke up at dawn to do some light reading into the Fundamentals of Magic book. This book explained why all spells seem to be in Latin or another language that isn't commonly spoken. As it turned out, any language could work for spells, however if you used the language you spoke most often as a base for a spell, your wand might spew spells even when you don't want it to eventually. Chapter 48, Wasted Time. The book did mention however that some languages simply made spell work easier or more powerful, such as Latin being rather on point for spell making, leaving it as the current best option. Well, outside Elvish it seems, but I'll keep that to myself for now. Nick thought after reading that piece of information. There were a few other interesting nuggets of information that Nick found in the hour he had to read before breakfast. Things like how most transfigurations weren't permanent because the object had a memory of what it was originally that wore down the magic until it was undone. Permanent transfiguration only happened when the memory of the object was rewritten into its new shape, basically erasing what it was originally. This level of transfiguration had only been seen in the case of the sorcerer's stone that could truly turn anything into something else like stone to gold, however, so it was debated whether it could even count as transfiguration magic. Nick had an odd expression when he read this, since he was wondering how on earth the Golden Trio was unable to find information on Nicholas Flamel for so long when the man's work was mentioned in even a book on the fundamentals of magic. I suppose if you were looking for his name alone in order to figure out what was in the third-floor corridor, you may have some issues. Nick thought, remembering that in a weird way the alchemist's name was almost never actually mentioned in books, merely his work instead. Harry got up at about 7 alongside Hermione and many other students for breakfast. "How long have you been up?" Hermione asked competitively. "Don't try it, you'll just end up depressed," Nick said without looking away from his book. "What is that supposed to mean?" the girl asked angrily. Nick sighed and put a slip of paper to mark his place in the book before closing it. "Don't try and compare yourself to me, don't try and match my pace, my habits. I am not you and you are not me. Trying to act otherwise will only leave you depressed and wondering why you aren't enough. It isn't worth it," he said sincerely while looking her in the eyes. He knew how competitive Hermione was from the books, but he also knew that he had both drive and talent far exceeding her own. She simply wouldn't be able to catch up with him. The girl was taken back by this and didn't seem to know what to say, because she was smart enough to realize that Nick had seen through her intentions immediately. "You should learn to be more humble," she said, not content to just leave without coming out on top of the conversation. Nick merely smiled sadly. "Time will prove my words correct, you'll see," he said before leaving the girl in the common room as he walked to the Great Hall. Perhaps it wasn't the greatest way to start the day, but the girl had brought it on herself. Nick didn't doubt she would try and copy his sleeping schedule once she figured out when he woke up normally. But that would only be the start of her problems, as even if she copied his every action, his own talent made the tasks easier for him than her. The only way she could catch up to him would be if he purposefully stagnated somehow, which he refused to do. Breakfast was a simply bowl of oats and bananas with a glass of orange juice on the side. The first class of the day was History of Magic, and Nick hated it with a passion. Professor Binns was a ghost, and that was literally the only thing interesting about the entire class. The ghost spoke like one would expect a textbook to sound if it could speak, and as a result was horribly hard to listen to seriously. Nick wondered if the class was purposefully set early in the morning just so students didn't fall asleep. Even worse in Nick's opinion was that the students didn't actually learn anything important, merely some useless information on the Goblin Wars that happened almost half a millennia ago. If the books are anything to go by, this doesn't get any better over the years either. Nick thought dreadfully as the ghost droned on and on about some first major Grimclaw who captured a castle, and that was the only significant thing the goblin ever did. Nick gave up on this class mentally and decided that he would just focus his mind on other more fruitful things instead of wasting his time, since the teacher didn't even question the students. Nick doubted that the ghost would even notice if he studied other things during the class instead. Chapter 49, Charms. Finally, the History of Magic class ended, and every student in the class, including Hermione, was reinvigorated as they moved on to the first part of the Charms lesson for the day. Harry and Nick met up with Tracy and Daphne on the way to the class, since they had Muggle studies instead of History of Magic in their first period. "The kitchen was right where you said it was," Tracy said in excitement when she got close enough. Nick acted like he was offended. "You didn't believe me? I am deeply hurt," he said dramatically, causing the two girls and Harry to laugh. "All jokes aside, want a cookie?" Nick asked with a grin as 3 chocolate chip cookies appeared in his hand from greed. "I'm so jealous. I want a cookie stash ring too," Tracy said enviously as she took one of the cookies out of Nick's hand. The other two also took a cookie while Nick merely grinned victoriously. "You should be jealous. Do you know how hard I had to work to get this ring? Months of effort," Nick complained. "The worst part is getting another one just like it is still going to take a huge amount of effort on my part, totally not worth it," he said regretfully. "You know, if you were pure-blooded you could just get rich with a single test at Gringotts and get a bunch of rings just like that, just saying," Daphne said without looking at him. Nick sighed. "Are you still on about that? I told you that's no fun at all. Where's the challenge? All it would accomplish is making Malfoy and the rest of those idiotic bigots look good, totally not worth it," he said honestly. "You know you just insulted like 70% of the wizarding world, right?" Tracy asked with a chuckle. "If they want to try and cause me problems they can learn that I ain't no pushover, dig." Nick said while imitating a 70s gangster accent. Harry laughed at the accent and the girls giggled, not to mention my good pal Harry here'll chew off their ears if they come at me. Nick threw his arm around Harry's shoulder with a wide grin. The girls were turning red from laughing so hard while Harry looked embarrassed. They reached the Charms classroom soon after that and Flitwick merely smiled when he saw the group from 2 different houses getting along. The Charms classroom was a large room with 2 rows of desks on either side of the room and a pile of books that Flitwick used to stand at the same level as a normal person at the far end. Normally the 2 houses didn't mix and sat on one side of the room each, but Nick's group sat on the Gryffindor side. Harry and Nick each sat of opposite sides of the girls so that they acted as a sort of buffer. They got quite a few mean looks from both of the houses, but Nick was more than willing to ignore them. Once the class was situated, Flitwick spoke up. Welcome to Charms class, where you'll learn jinxes, hexes, and everything in between. Today, for example, we shall start out very simple with the light casting spell. Mr. Iron, would you mind giving a demonstration? He asked while giving Nick a grin. Do you want the basic version or my own twist on the spell? Nick asked, not bothered at all. Why not both? I am quite curious what you'll show us. Flitwick said with a look of interest. Nick left his desk and stood in the center of the room and flicked his wand Lumos. And a bright white light appeared on the tip of his wand. That was the normal version. He said casually before pointing his wand up and rotating it clockwise. Lumos milliject. From his wand 1,000 small bright lights shot into the air and hovered overhead like a fake set of stars. Everyone including Flitwick gasped in awe at the beautiful scene shown. Nick pointed his wand downwards and spun it counterclockwise Nox Senium. And the lights started to fade one by one like dying stars in a hauntingly beautiful display. I call that the Starlight Dirge combo. Nick said with a smile. The final song of the stars, a fitting name indeed. 10 points to Gryffindor for the magnificent use of the Lumos charm. Flitwick said happily. As Mr. Iron has demonstrated, even the most simple spell can produce extraordinary results. You may all begin practicing the Lumos spell as described in your books, and remember that wand movement is important. He finished speaking and hopped off the stack of books to approach Nick, who was still in the center of the room. Chapter 50, Charms, 2. Flitwick waved his wand once he got near Nick, causing a silencing charm around them to isolate their conversation. This wasn't strictly necessary, but hearing the word Lumos over and over while you were talking is plain distracting. Your choice of wording for the spell was rather on the nose, no? I am not complaining since the results spoke for themselves, but it does stoke my curiosity. Flitwick said with a smile. Nick grinned. I have figured out that the intent behind a spell is just as important as its wording. I wanted to recreate the stars, so I held that image in my head and found the best words for what I wanted the spell to do. So the English translation for the spell was literally throw 1,000 lights, whereas the change to the counter spell Nox literally changed it to a fading night, creating the spectacle you saw before. I am curious if any of my classmates might try and copy my spell to impress the opposite gender. Nick said with a laugh. Flitwick also chuckled. I am sure it will certainly happen eventually. You are however correct about the intent behind magic being important, though you are underestimating how important. He said helpfully. Nick was surprised by this and fell deep into thought, since if a charm master like Flitwick said so, it should be true. Now then, if it's not too much trouble, could I ask you to help your fellow students with the spell for an extra 10 points? Flitwick asked with a smile. Nick shrugged. It's not a problem for me. The members of Slytherin House may feel a bit slighted to be taught by a Muggleborn. It shouldn't be too much of an issue though. Nick said with a casual grin. Flitwick sighed and shook his head in disappointment. You are referring to that blood purity nonsense. Honestly, it is a mindset proven wrong over and over, yet these people still foolishly cling to it, rather infuriating. The small man said, upset. That is the definition of insanity after all, doing the same thing over and over expecting a different result. Nick said with a shrug. Quite. Well, best get to it. Most of these students won't teach themselves after all. Flitwick said, instantly back to his normal jovial self as he dispelled the isolation spell wordlessly. Nick didn't immediately move after the professor started walking back to his stack of books in order to properly overlook the class. He saw that most of the class wasn't having trouble getting their wands to light up so much as the spell was dim or unstable. There were a few, such as Ron and Neville, who kept making mistakes with the wand movement. Seamus Finnegan, however, was a nuisance in that rather than light, he had somehow ended but setting a sheet of paper on fire. Let's start with him. Nick decided before he walked towards the boy in question. Hey mate, can I ask you to try one more time so I can see if I can help you out a bit? Nick asked with a friendly smile. Seamus nodded and attempted the spell a second time, getting similar results as the first. Your wand movement is wrong, here watch. Nick said and showed Seamus the correct wand movement but slowed down. The boy paid close attention and when Nick was done showing it for the third time he was asked to try it. This time no flame was produced but the light that showed up was flickering and unstable. Lumos. Nick cast the spell in front of Seamus. Look at this spell closely, memorize its appearance and the shadows it cast and once you have it firmly in your head try again. Nick suggested and the boy as well as a few others struggling did as he suggested. Flitwick was grinning so wide one would have thought his face would split when he saw the progress his students made under Nick's instructions. Many who were struggling in the class were following his directions and showing immediate results. Flitwick even noticed that some of the members of Slytherin were paying attention to Nick's words and actions. Natural leader, Albus is right to be cautious of him. If he wanted to he could easily become the next Dark Lord, on par with Grindelwald even in terms of charisma. The teacher thought seriously. He seems like a good lad though so I have faith he won't end up like those two he thought calmly. Once Seamus was mostly set for the spell Nick walked into the center of the room again to observe the entire class for anyone needing help. Neville was having trouble with the spell even though he had paid attention to what Nick said.